Hey guys, welcome to Wood.Work.LIFE. So I've been using a 1977 Craftsman table saw for a long time now, and I see a lot of you guys using the new rigid 4512. So it's inspired me to kind of upgrade a little bit. And I figured when I was putting together this saw and going through some of the paces with it, I'd go ahead and film it and show you guys a little bit how to set up a table saw, getting the blade square and the fence set up, and then also some of the basic uses of a table saw. And some of the basic terminology. And I also want to show you how to throw together a quick cross-cut sled, which is one of the most integral tools to keep you safe and to make accurate cuts through your table saw. So let's jump right into it.
The first thing we're going to do is align the table saw arbor with one of the miter slots. Don't try to align it with both of them, as this will be an exercise in futility on a contractor saw or even a mid-grade cabinet saw. You'll use your combination square and one tooth on the blade. We'll call this your magic tooth for all of your measurements to keep things consistent. Loosen the two arbor bolts connecting the motor assembly to the bottom of the table and nudge the arbor into alignment while tweaking the tension on the arbor bolts until the blade is perfectly parallel with one of your miter slots. The next step is going to be to adjust the throat insert plate. With this, you'll just use the blade on your combination square and a screwdriver to adjust the leveling screws until the plate is perfectly parallel with the cast iron top. Now that we've set up the throat plate, it's time to set the 90 and 45 degree detents on the saw. On this rigid saw, it's as simple as loosening some Allen keys and turning the knobs until you have a perfect 90 and 45 set up. The 90 is easy, just use your most accurate square and set it up. For the 45, it's a little more difficult. You can use your combination square as a reference for 45 degrees, but you want to make some test cuts and check the fit before you really dial it in. What I do is I cut two 45s at the same time, check them for 90, make some adjustments, repeat that, and continue until I get a perfect 90 degree joint. This way you're checking two 45 degree cuts instead of just one. This doubles the accuracy of your measurement. Once you have your detents set up, it's time to check the accuracy on your fence. You want this to be parallel to the miter slot and also 90 degrees to the table. Checking to the miter slot's easy, just line it up with the miter slot and use your finger to check for any protrusions. After that, use your most accurate square to make sure that it's square to the table. If it is off at all, you can use these little nylon bolts to adjust the 90, and you can loosen the bolts on the fence, these Allen keys here, to adjust it left and right to get it perfectly parallel with that miter slot. Now that we have all our adjustments made, it's just time for a coat of protective wax. I just apply this liberally, 1, 2, 3 coats, however many I think it needs. This protects against rust and also lubricates the surface to make plywood and stickier woods glide across the table a little bit easier. Some quick safety first. When you're adjusting your blade, make sure that just the tooth of the blade goes up past the work. And the throat plate, use that as an indicator. If you're getting your hands near there, you're too close to the blade. Use a push stick. It's a lot easier to repair a push stick or buy a new one than get a new finger. If you are making a rip cut, make sure that you have the riving knife installed if your saw came with one. This helps to protect against the saw blade getting bound up inside the wood if it's under tension. Now adjust the rip fence so that it's in the position to make your cut. It's called a rip fence because it's used for making rip cuts. A rip cut is any cut that goes along the grain of the wood. So if you're cutting on the length of the grain, that's a rip cut. If you're not making a rip cut, it's probably not safe to use a rip fence. And if you're cutting across the grain, that's called a cross cut. And once you go to cut across the grain, that's when you want to use your miter gauge, or even better, a crosscut sled. In this case, I'm using a combination blade, a 40-tooth blade, to make both rip and crosscuts. Ideally, you'd use a rip blade to rip with around 24 teeth, and a crosscut blade with 80 to 100 to make crosscuts. But if you were going to own one blade, a combination blade would be the way to go. The beginning of any good crosscut sled is a good square, flat piece of plywood, in this case 1/2-inch maple ply. You may want to use Baltic birch for stability, but this is what I had laying around. You also want to get some hardwood for runners and fences. In this case I'm using Osage orange, might be a little bit overkill with a Janka rating of 2620. It's one of the hardest hardwoods in America, but it's easily accessible in Missouri, so I'll use it. Start by cutting my fences, and then moving on to the runners that I'm going to install into the miter slots. In this case, my fences are 2 1/8 inch tall. This is dictated by the flip and stop system from Kreg, and that's fine for me. I used to use my crosscut sled for plywood. And then for the miter slots, you really just want to cut those to fit. The fit of your runners for a crosscut sled or any jig you're going to use on your table saw is the most critical piece. So be patient and sneak up on your measurement. That way you don't remove too much material. You can always remove material, but it's a lot harder to put it back on. Anyways, I kept working on these runners until they fit just perfectly snugly into the slot, while still being able to slide without any impediment. Since your miter bars are going to be cut a little bit shallow of the miter slots, since you don't want them to bottom out when they're attached to your jig, I put a couple of bolts on the bottom of the miter slot to raise them up above the tabletop to attach the top of the miter sled. I used a few dabs of super glue to attach the top of the miter sled. That way I could flip it over to add nails or screws or whatever you wanted to use to attach it to the bottom of the sled. I used my fence to help align and keep it square. This just made things a little bit easier to align later. Looks like nothing shifted during my glue up, so we're ready to move on to the next step. Now most people permanently attach their runners with screws. I prefer to use nails. I just have better luck without splitting the wood and not having to pre-drill all the holes. The extra step of snipping the nails and filing them flush, not that big of a deal for me. I just use some snippers and a flat file and get through it pretty quick. Now this next step is only necessary if you're using Kreg's flip and stop system. I cut a small rabbet to house Kreg's flip and stop rail. I use this thing on anything that I'm going to use for precision cuts. It's just easy to make quick repeatable cuts, and I fell in love with it when I installed one on my miter bench. For this, all you'll do is take your back rail and cut a quick rabbet using your table saw that you just calibrated, so it should be a perfect rabbet anyway. Drill some holes in the rail and attach it with a couple screws. Next we'll install our back rail. The fit of this is not critical, so just line it up with the back edge of the plywood and attach it with screws. This is really just there to hold the thing together. It doesn't actually affect the accuracy of your cuts. Be sure not to put any screws where the blade's going to pass through the plywood. That would make for a bad day. Next you'll install the front fence with just 2 screws. Make sure you measure out where you're going to install the screws. It's easiest if this is a measurement easily divisible by 5. Pre-drill and install 2 screws. It'll make more sense in just a minute. Before you put the second screw in, very carefully raise the blade through the center of the saw. This is going to give you a reference line to align that front fence with before installing the second screw. Don't go all the way through the fences, just make a cut in the middle of the sheet. Now take your most accurate square and longest square, typically this is going to be a framing square, and line it up with the cut you just made. Once you can get that back fence as close as you possibly can to align with that, this is going to give you the best bet that you're going to have minimal adjustments using the 5-cut method that I'm going to show you here in just a minute. Now we're going to perfectly calibrate your front fence on your table saw sled. For this, we're going to be using the 5-cut method. And what this is making 5 cuts, each referencing off the previous cut face, and saving the off-cut from the 5th cut to understand the error multiplied by 5 because of the 5 cuts. This makes any error you have in your fence just a little bit more obvious. On your final cut, be sure to save that off-cut. That's what you're going to be using to measure. Of course we're square now, but how square are we? We want to multiply that by 5 to figure out exactly what that is. So mark A and B on the different ends of the cut, and mark which side was down so that you know which end's which. Now carefully measure each side of that offcut. Calipers are the best application, but you can probably get away with a combination square if you have to. And also very accurately measure the length of the offcut, in this case 17 7/8 inches.
Okay, and now comes the fun part, of course, the math, right? So you're going to take that measurement A that we had, in this case 1.189 inches. You're going to subtract your B measurement, 1.1425 in this situation, and we get the difference of around 4.6 hundredths of an inch. Now that's 5 times the error since we made 5 cuts. So you take that and divide that by 5, we get 9 thousandths of an inch of error. Now that's over the length of this entire piece. So this is 17.875 inches long, so we divide that by 17.875. And we get 5 10,000ths of an inch error per inch. Now, if we wanted to take that and translate that to the 30 inches that we know between the 2 screw points, between the pivot and where we have it anchored, we know how much to adjust at the point of that second screw. So I'll take this 5 10,000ths of an inch by 30, and we get 1.5 hundredths of an inch. That's going to be pretty hard to do that, and honestly, if I were just doing this for myself, I'd be done, but I'll go through a little bit and how to try to get that last little bit of accuracy out of this saw. And now, since this is a positive number, we know that the blade is actually, or that this fence is actually tilting a little bit this way. Is that right? This way. If it was a negative number, it'd be tilting the opposite way. So that's something to take into consideration. So we have 0.15 inches positive, so we know that it's tilting this way a little bit. So we need to move the fence that way. 0.15 hundredths of an inch. So let's get out the calipers and see if we can do that. Just to give you an idea of how much 0.15 inches is, it's that. So yeah, I think we're pretty spot on. But if you had more error than this, you may want to make further adjustments. I'll show you how to do that.
So let's say we had some actual error to correct for, 7/10 of an inch. All right, that's doable. So we'll put that up. You got your little protrusion here that you can use to adjust. You lock that up against the existing position of the fence, mark it, and adjust to that line. Then you repeat the 5-cut method again, and measure again, and do your math again. And believe it or not, I actually went through this with that 0.015 correction, and I actually just overshot it and ended up over-adjusting negative the other direction. Like I said, you'll never be perfect, so at some point you're just chasing futility. Once you have it as accurate as you're comfortable with, go ahead and install the rest of the screws. Pre-drill, do the same thing, and you'll be good to go. Now you have a perfectly set up table saw sled. The only step left is to install your stop fence, in my case the Kreg flip and stop system, but you could use this for setting up any of these. I make a test cut, I very accurately measure it, then I mark where the indicator is on the gauge, and then I just use that reference point and the measurement I made before and line those up on the tape. This will give you an accurate measurement, and that way you can move your flip and stop system between your miter sled like I've got and your miter table. Easy enough.
All right, so there you have it. A properly calibrated table saw and a crosscut sled. Properly calibrated tools are a great way to get more accurate and repeatable results. And then a crosscut sled is an easy way to get more accuracy out of your table saw while also making it safer to use. So thanks for watching today, and for whatever reason this video is a bear to make, so please drop me a like below. And if this is your first time finding my channel, please consider subscribing. And if you've been watching my channel over time, please consider becoming a direct funder by either buying products off our Amazon affiliate links down below. Just set it as your homepage for Amazon, and whatever you buy off Amazon will directly fund the channel. Or become a patron on Patreon to help fund new equipment, materials, and tools to build future products and make future videos. So thanks for watching today, and remember to keep your tools sharp and keep your mind even sharper.